Next, let's give a warm welcome to the Director of International Relationships, Sports and Business Center of Stockholm School of Economics, Nick.
谢谢，我非常荣幸有机会跟大家今天介绍一下关于我们最新的想法，关于中国新时代的体育。I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak to you. I will do so in English rather than Chinese, given that it is a bit complicated, still for me, having lived there. Next slide. Chinese sports has developed very rapidly in recent years. In particular, we have seen the interest from the Chinese government stimulating this sector since the early years of Xi Jinping. And from 2015 and onwards, you have seen policies regarding football and elsewhere in the winter sports as well. A key feature of this has been to attract great coaches from all around the world, some of which you can see here. I don't know if you could guess, perhaps, in which sports they belong to. I give you a few seconds to guess. The one on the far up left is in biathlon. It's the greatest biathlon skier in the history. And then you have in football, then you have in curling, and then you have in ice hockey. Well, what has been very common then is for China to attract these individuals to train and to transfer knowledge to improve sports. And this has also not just happened in the professional sector, but also in youth sport, where you have corresponding coaches coming into as well. And while this is a good thing, there is a problem that has arisen in this as well. And that is because China has maybe attracted these coaches very early on without building a system around it as to develop the absorptive capacity, meaning to really be able to add on new knowledge and new skill on already existing knowledge. As a result, if we could move to the next slide, we think at the Center for Sport and Business that the issue of the Guobanfa 40号 last year was incredibly important in recognizing that one of the key features for China to develop its sports market comes to develop the organizations themselves, not just focus on what's happening on the pitch or on the competition around the athlete, but really professionalizing the organization as a whole. And that's something that I will be focusing on today, introducing a framework that we are using at the Center for Sport and Business here at the Stockholm School of Economics in Sweden, that to develop sports. Next slide, please. And so what we do at the Center for Sport and Business is quite simple. We build world-class organizations on and off the pitch. Next slide. And what we have done in recent years is that we have been able to establish a world-class, unique knowledge network of researchers from around the world in the areas related to sports and business. Today, we are more than 40 researchers from 19 universities in 12 different countries. These researchers span from accounting and finance, strategic management, marketing, and economics and international business. They are from the far west of Stanford Graduate School of Business to the far east of the University of New South Wales. We have a unique feature in that the researchers involved in our center are not primarily sports researchers, but they are expert in their particular fields. And their intention of working with sports is to use sports data to develop new theory-driven research in their respective fields. We are very proud. Just 1 second back again. We're very proud to cooperate as well on institutional level in China with Beijing Sports University and Tsinghua University. And I think one of the distinguishing factors of us is that we're also incredibly proud to have 2 members of the Nobel Committee in economics as part of our center, including the chairman, Per Strömberg. Next slide. But theory alone is not enough. While we are proud to have a very strong scientific rigor in what we do, we're equally interested and attach great importance in driving the practical matter. And here our practical relevance comes into having a history of transforming sports organizations on a national level. So we work in football, skiing, trotting, ice hockey, swimming, Olympics, golf, etc. Transforming them both with management programs, but also research projects. Next slide. And this is the question that a lot of us are being asked at this point in time. What will the sports look like post-COVID-19? What would it look like? And the answer, if we were to quote one of like Niels Bohr, famous physicist, a Nobel laureate, is that it is difficult to predict, especially about the future. Or to quote, next slide, please. My favorite poet, the late Thomas Tranströmer, is that the calendar may be full and the future is unknown. So in reality, next slide, no one really knows what the future holds. It's impossible to know. And if you take a look at this graph, just below you here, what it really shows is just the weekless jobless claims in the United States leading up to the beginning of this year when the coronavirus hit. If somebody had been at the end, say November last year, predicting and showing you this graph, would you have believed them? I certainly wouldn't. Nobody would have been able to foresee this happening. So, or just if you take in the sports world, if we in December would have said that there would have been no Olympics, would anyone have believed me? So the reality is that it's impossible for people to fully know what's going to happen into the future. And we are then faced with choices. One choice is to pretend we know. And this is what you see a lot in consultancy reports, and you see a lot in the experts nowadays days coming out and with suggestions. This is how the so-called new normal will look like. The problem arising with that is that once you do that, you sort of, first of all, you are not really sticking to the truth, because again, nobody really knows what's going to happen. But you're also closing off a very explorative phase where you can examine and investigate different opportunities and possibilities and being very definite in what is to come. So next slide, please. So the other option is to embrace. So when you embrace not knowing, what happens? And here is like one of our great colleagues who is at Harvard University, Amy Edmondson, has sort of come up with a great book called The Fearless Organization that I warmly recommend you to read, which talks about the great thing that when we embrace not knowing, we open up curiosity to learn. When we stick to the truth, we create trust among people around us. And when we engage with our colleagues, we empower creativity to flow out. So a key feature that we see in different organizations that we work with to professionalize here in the Nordics is that this is the kind of attitude that they need to take at this time moving forward. Next slide, please. So what does it then mean when you have sort of embraced not knowing? Well, you need to develop a new kind of skill and work with that. And that is really to learn on the fly. Next slide. So learning on the fly can really take place in 4 different ways. The first one, which is if you do competition based on experience. This is what I call learning by expertise. So here you do not cooperate with anyone. Each organization, each sports organization work on its own. And the key feature is that the expert is sort of the leader and driver of innovation. It takes place to gain market share rather than to grow the pie as a whole. And this is characteristic of how sports looked like in Northern Europe. I don't know the time fully in China, so I cannot give that specifically. But in Northern Europe, this was the case in the early 60s, 70s, up to 80s and 90s, where you would have a couple of teams very strong with a good tradition, with great organizations themselves, but nobody else were really learning. So you would come there and go to the experts. The second is to learn based upon learning by trying. Here you compete while you use experiments. So different organizations try different ideas, but they don't share the outcome and results. So here you still don't share anything, but you compete on both data and the ideas, the insights. And it's really done in areas of linear transitions of development. It's really the disruptor who is the sort of the hero in this story. And this is very characteristic of innovation that you have seen coming out of Silicon Valley for the last 20 years or so. It's been very much focused around this idea that people want to disrupt, to change the status quo of the industry that they're entering into. My argument, having lived and spent a lot of time working with China, is that China is incredibly shaped by this idea. It's very profusely ingrained in many different aspects of the society. This idea of driven for competition. And the sports world is no exception. But it then brings a problem. And that problem is that it's very unevenly distributed, the development of sports. So you see a couple of sports organizations, maybe located in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, etc., that are very well advanced and very well run. But then if you decide to go to Inner Mongolia, or you go to Heilongjiang, or you go to Hainan, the situation might be very different. Experience have not been transferred to one another. And this makes then difficult to raise the entire Chinese sports industry upwards. So we're going to come back to it in a moment. The third option is to cooperate around experience. And this is what we call learning by co-creation. It's an incredibly popular method, really sponsored by the countries or in the Nordics, where I come from. So if you were to ask the Swedish government, what's the way to innovate? It's really to do so in this manner. What you have here is that different organizations work around the same idea, and they share everything. No competition happening at all. It happens really in static context as well, but here you have large investments up front. And this is really to share resources. The problem as we see it from our perspective is that it is a very costly way of driving innovation and really development of sports, simply because you're focusing all of your resources into one idea as opposed to many. And so if that turns out to be wrong, what are you going to do? So we're not that particularly fond of this perspective. Instead, the one that we think is very applicable to today is the fourth and final way of learning, which is learning by sharing. So please, next. So learning by sharing takes place when you have different organizations working on different ideas, but they share their insights, the data that they arrive on. And what they really compete on is not the data, but the ideas themselves. And this takes place in times of discontinuities, like we're living in right now, with COVID-19 having disrupted us. The key feature here is it's about market growth, to grow the entire market, not just for the organization itself in matter. It's not a zero-sum game, as you would find in learning by trying, where a few succeed and most don't succeed. And it's really driven by the catalyst, the person who can bring together many different stakeholders around a common vision to drive change, rather than the disruptor. And if you put the next, what we are arguing very strongly based on our research is that we need to move China from a learning by trying to a learning by sharing kind of experience, in order to facilitate and arrive at the incredible results that China has set up in its ambitious goals for the future. So the future, when it comes to sports in the new era, has to be this fundamental shift. And China has been doing so before. If you think back at how China made its opening up and reforms, it was by trying and exploring different kinds of ideas in different cities, whether it was marketing reforms in Shanghai, or you did it in particular in Pudong, or if you take into Shenzhen and Shekou. These kinds of experimentations, some of which succeeded, some did not, then were lent and spread to the rest of China. Now, this same core principle, really of crossing the river by touching the stones, is an incredibly powerful force that, once applied, can help China to really become not just a dominating, strong sports country, but really to be a Qiangguo. So sorry, rather than being a big sports country, you become a Qiangguo, a strong sports country. So if you look at the differences are from where you are today, generally speaking, is that rather than focusing on winning, we need to focus on growing. Rather than to compete on data, we need to spread and share and compete on ideas. Rather than to celebrate the disruptor, we need to look at transformation. Now, how can we sort of get to this place? There are a couple of points, and I can see that on the screen, one of them are already there, which is to focus on purpose. Purpose will be the key to drive this, but I will come back to it a bit later. So if you take next slide. The key is to really point to the size of the pie rather than to sort of ask for a small share of the small pie. So when you look at what China's sports market is today, it's quite small compared to what it can be in other countries. So I think the Chinese sports market is about 1% of the GDP. In a country such as Sweden, it's about 3%. So you think about how quickly the Chinese economy is developing overall. In order for the sports market then to grow to the point where it is in developed countries, such as my country, it's going to have to be growing at an incredible pace. And so the key first issue then is to say, rather than to sort of stake out a bigger size of the share right now, let's focus on growing it together. And that means we're not done there yet. That means to take the long-term view rather than the short-term view. It means to celebrate the catalyst above the disruptor. We have to promote the culture where it is not just about leading, but also joining in. Because once you do learning by sharing, it's not always someone driving that is celebrated, but people who can come back behind and support and develop. And we also need to engage with one another across industries. Across industries in this respect could be, if you are a youth sports organization, to work, say in football, to work with other people or another organization in a completely different sport, be it skiing, be it ice hockey, be it in swimming even, to get the experience. And when it comes to focus on purpose, I will say this, it's incredibly important to really ask yourself, what is the purpose of the sports organization? If you take ice hockey in Sweden, that has been very successful internationally, the purpose is not winning. The purpose are twofold. First, to get youth people interested and excited about doing sports, in particular ice hockey. Second, to make them model citizens, to inspire them into having a very civic mindset to contribute to society at home. This wholesome idea of what it means to be sport makes it then very sustainable over the long term. People are not just joining for competing and winning, they're joining to transform and grow themselves. Next slide. So, having provided this very abstract, you could say, framework, I shall end by providing just examples of where we have already deployed it here in the Nordics. If you look at the pictures here on the far left, you see us with the presidents and chairmen of the Norwegian, Swedish, and Finnish ski federations. So normally they are great competitors, where Sweden and Norway in particular are very, very competitive when it comes to skiing. But what they found is that when the sport itself of skiing cannot be developed by themselves alone. They need to come together and work together. And what they do with us is to really reimagining of what skiing will look like into the future. And indeed, we have also talked about their contributions to Chinese sports. I know that the Norwegians have shared that they have sent more than 80 coaches to China to train and to develop ahead of the 2022 Olympics. And to have the opportunity to sit down with your competitors, but be fully transparent. Because they're not competing, you see, in the organization in terms of getting sponsorship and all that. They are all on the same page there. So really an insight is to define where do you compete. And once you have defined that, in that particular area, all the rest you can really find areas of common ground. And that's what we've done. The second and third is we do the same in ice hockey. So Sweden has the second best hockey league in the world after NHL. And here we have brought together all the club chairmen, every single one of them, to work, and we do it about 20 days a year. They spend time working on everything from their marketing strategy, their accounting books, with their competitors. The result has been that they have been much more resilient in these times of the COVID-19 crisis, getting to know one another and being able to share best practices. The same has been in football, which and I would say that I would be daring to say that if they hadn't worked around working together jointly, some of the clubs would not have been able to survive the difficulties that have been the strains now with COVID-19. But now they're not just surviving, but they're even thriving in an incredibly hostile environment. Next slide. So what we do is that we do basically these 5 components where we identify what we call a strategic challenge with the sports. The strategic challenge that we have worked around in all of the sports that you've shown is to professionalize the sports themselves, to really put as much emphasis on the organizations as we do on top athletes. Coming back to what I said at the beginning, that in order for China to move to the next stage, they need to professionalize not just the training experience, but the organization around it to develop the absorptive capacity of the organizations. We tie this to research with our researchers that have shown that are published in FT, Financial Times 50 journals, the top journals in accounting, finance, strategic management, marketing, and economics. We integrate it into our research, into our teaching, where our students, who are the top students in the Nordics, and to be able to write their master theses, to come out and work and explore and meet with the different organizations. We help in recruiting by bringing together different kind of stakeholders, whether it be local government, whether it is just at our school ourselves, to want to work in the sports arena, so as to pull in new talent that maybe haven't previously worked there, many of which anyway want to do so. And finally, we work with executive education, which are these sports leaders that you saw in the previous slide. And here we really drive to make the organizations better. And I should say that what we have done is that we have really made transformation concrete. So we have identified really 3 larger areas. One is called efficiency, one is innovation, and the third is sustainability. These 3 areas we have made concrete in 12 different subcategories that we work with our researchers to transfer the knowledge that we gain from research into the organizations. And the results have been spectacular. Final slide. Next slide. So in summary, is that the COVID-19 crisis, coronavirus, has made people around the world in sports to ask themselves, what will sports look like after the COVID-19? And the biggest mistake that people can do these days is to say they know. Nobody knows. Instead, what we need to do is to embrace learning on the fly. This is incredibly important at this time. And what China has to, as a whole, do is to move and transfer itself from a learning by trying attitude in sports to more of adopting a learning by sharing in order to achieve the overall goal that China has already set out. This is very much in line in what the government policies that have been issued in recent years, in particular the recent just last month. So we think that the Chinese government is very much on track in adopting it. What we see is that cross-industry collaboration will be incredibly important moving forward. So what I should suggest, if we are sports organizations around the provinces, is to really join in associations where you can actually find this cross collaboration. They could be set up maybe also on a national level. And finally, final slide. If there are anyone who's interested in what we have presented a bit here and want to drive more of this development and change moving forward in China, we are very, very eager to get in touch with you. So you can reach out to me or my colleagues, and you will find the details here. 谢谢大家.
Thanks for your sharing. I guess many of us will benefit from your speech.